So, this episode is a continuation of last week's episode or last 2 weeks ago episode. So, if you haven't already listened to that one, it should be right above this one in your podcast feed or episode 245. Stop and go listen now, as it will make the most sense when listened to in order.
So this week we pick up where we left off with the remaining four independent and interdependent dimensions of well-being: spiritual, vocational, financial, and environmental. I know that sounds like a mouthful already, but promise me this makes sense, right? We're talking about what humans need to feel well, like they're thriving. And these are the last four. We already talked about the earlier ones in last episode, like you mentioned, me, Sasha. So are we ready to get to it?
Yes.
Welcome to the Dear White Women podcast, the show that helps white women use their privilege to uproot systemic racism without centering themselves in the process. We are your multi-ethnic, Japanese, and white hosts, Sarah and me, Sasha. So this dimension, spiritual well-being, is all about finding purpose, value, and meaning in your life, with or without organized religion. And maybe you can be participating in activities that are consistent with your beliefs and values. Even just talking about spirituality makes me kind of go, ooh, I think we might be wading into murky waters here with this topic. I think a lot of times because this is a really personal topic, right? I think spirituality is a very personal conversation. And I also know that if you're diving into organized religion, it can be a very divisive topic these days in our country. So looking at why Trump may not be great for our spiritual well-being as a nation, I do think it's maybe safe to say that those with the organized religion called Christianity may feel totally fine, safe, and validated under a Trump presidency, depending on how critically you think about things like Trump hawking American flag stamped Bibles, or having been married 3 times, or being found guilty for sexual abuse and repeatedly accused of sexual assault, being convicted of business fraud and having never really showed much interest in church services, maybe even the fact that he declared himself the chosen one back in 2019.
I mean, if you're listening to this list about literally anyone else, feel like it's a disqualifier. Just saying.
Right? I mean, it's worth noting that according to Pew Research, Christianity in the US is on the decline. So if you look back 50 years ago, Christians accounted for about 90% of the US population, which, while I knew that, really still was a number that was so huge that startled me. And then if you look at it as of 2020, Christianity and people who identify as Christians are just about 64% of the population. So a lot less, though it's still a clear majority in the United States. But I think regardless of your belief in Christianity, I think the further question to it is, do you believe in the separation of church and state as it's written into the First Amendment for the Constitution? Because that, me, Sasha, my lawyer friend, you want to talk about how maybe that's coming down?
Well, no, I want you to talk about it, but I just wanted to, raise my hand and say, yeah, I believe in separation of church and state. Hey, so did the people who founded our country, if we want to go all the way back there.
Right. I want to think a little critically about some things. Like, do you think that letting coaches and students pray Christian prayers at this particular example at a public school football game is okay? Because that was what happened in our country. And if you believe so, would it be okay for a Muslim coach to pray and or have their students pray at the games on prayer rugs? I mean, just in order to stay consistent with the expression and the separation or not of church and state, of religion and public life. Or if you look at the ban on abortion impacting millions of women and families across the nation due to predominantly pretty much one religion's view, Christianity, we have to note that that is different than what, say, Judaism supports, which is that a single person can make their own moral and faith-informed decisions about their body health and their future. There's, in fact, a movement afoot where people are exploring the idea that a complete prohibition on abortion is inconsistent with Jewish law and tradition. And so I guess the biggest question is, would you be okay with it if other religions' views were imposed upon your freedoms? Because I guess the question of whether a Trump presidency would support the spiritual well-being of the portion of Christians who don't believe that Trump is a Christian role model and or the 29% of Americans who are religious, quote, nuns, not N-U-N, but N-O-N-E-S, meaning people who describe themselves as like an atheist or agnostic or nothing in particular when they're asked about their religious identity, or even the 6% who are non-Christian faiths like Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist or Hindu. I don't think a Trump presidency and this conflating of religion with our public life is going to be good for that percentage of our population.
I mean, I agree. And I think about like how at times a small group of people being very loud, right, gets sort of this overlarge mic. And I think about, Sarah, when you were talking about Christianity, I think about like sort of the extremes of Christianity, right? Like evangelical faith. And along with that, sort of the increasing prevalence of this concept of trad wives or the traditional super heavy air quotes, right? Views of the role of women in society that's now sort of being perpetuated on social media in line with what you were talking about abortion bans and women's losing rights to control their own bodies, right? Which is definitely goes against certain faiths and beliefs. But I also think that ties into it's important to notice who's not being loud and vocal against Trump here. And I would say that, I don't know, I haven't heard any evangelical leaders really coming out loudly against Trump. And I think because they know in him they have a mouthpiece. And though they may be, an increasingly decreasing percentage of the US, it's kind of like, the MAGA constituency in Congress, right? Like they have an outsized mic. And with Trump as president, they have outsized control over the path of our nation. So that's what I think about when I think about spiritual well-being, right? There is the potential for a very small group of people to control the well-being for all of us, which is really scary. And on the last thing I'll say is on this topic is I find the hypocrisy in people who claim to love the Constitution about certain things, like, I don't know, the Second Amendment, who suddenly are like, what's that First Amendment? Or, anything that you can kind of selectively read the Constitution. You can't selectively read the Constitution, right? You can interpret it for the times that we are in, but you cannot selectively decide that you're okay with that on one hand and be really loud about it. And then throw out the parts that don't jive with your sort of view. I don't know, let's call it an authoritarian playbook 2025 of the country.
I'm so glad you added that perspective and brought the lawyer in you out. Because a lawyer is a vocation, and I want to talk about vocational wellness next.
Wow, look at your transition there.
Oh, thank you. Your vocation is about your job, your occupation, and having wellness in this realm is about preparing for and participating in work that gives you personal satisfaction and life enrichment that really goes in line with your values, your goals, and your lifestyles, right? Like you get to contribute your own unique skills and gifts and talents to work that is personally meaningful and rewarding. And I think this is something that we're reading a lot about. Maybe you feel it too. People want the thing that they spend 8+ hours a day on to support their growth by giving them opportunities to upskill, get promoted, to be good for their physical and mental health, and let them earn enough money to live a decent life with food on the table and a roof over their head, some health insurance to boot, right? So when we're looking at what that means for your job, your career, to take care, for the value exchange to be even, you're giving them so much time and they should be taking care of these needs that you need to survive. Let's talk about unions. It segues because unions are a driving force behind a middle class. On average, unions raise the wages of their members by 10 to 15%. They also improve fringe benefits and workplace procedures like retirement plans, workplace grievance policies, predictable scheduling. And these workplace improvements really do build middle-class financial stability and worker well-being. We have seen still a very small number of people participating in unions so far, but based on all the headlines we've seen, there are many more people and companies agitating to form unions, and support for labor unions is at a very high level. I think over 70% at this point in this country, right? Now, let's look at it through the lens of Trump. During his presidency, the National Labor Relations Board, the members that he appointed there that oversee complaints about labor issues, they made it more difficult for unions to win representation at non-union workplaces. They forced like an extension of time between when a union files for representation to when an election is held. And that gives management more time to campaign against the union with its employees. The Trump Supreme Court also issued a devastating ruling against public sector unions, which represent also almost as many union members as you see in private businesses, right? Public sector, governmental work versus private businesses. And Trump has continued to take shots at, say, the United Auto Workers Union, UAW, saying, among other things, that they were betraying their workers. So the AFL-CIO president, Liz Schuler, stated that for his entire time as president, Trump actively sought to roll back worker protections, wages, and the right to join a union at every level. Meanwhile, Biden at this point in the election cycle is getting the backing of many unions like North America's Building Trade Unions, United Steelworkers, United Auto Workers, and what I just talked about, the largest union, AFL-CIO.
I think it's really important here to go back to like one of the themes that we keep talking about because Trump tells us, right, who he is, despite the image that he's trying to portray, right? Sarah, what you talked about Trump doing in his presidency, right, to sort of stifle the unions and the ability for your average person to join a union or to even form a union, right, is really contradictory to the image he would like us to see, right, of this guy who's like for every man, right? Or, well, I was going to say and woman, but I don't think that's true at all. So, I think that he isn't, right? We have to parse through like what he projects and look at what he says and does, because I think that's key. Unions are so, we've talked about unions on the podcast before. I think that you can't discount the role of unions, right? And the fact that you have someone on the other hand who is trying to actively shut them down, or, I think about the disagreement he got into with Sean Fain, right? And like, it's an odd thing to do if you're for every man to go after a union leader. Like, I'm just saying. So I think we need to be very cognizant of what Trump says and what he does versus what he's trying to project.
Agreed. I mean, say you have thoughts on unions and you want to just talk about something outside of it, like job stability and job opportunity. In February of 2024, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that the American economy added 353,000 jobs in January, bringing the total jobs created under Biden to 14.8 million. The unemployment rate has been holding steady. It's been holding at this low rate of 3.7%, which is a 2-year trend of a jobless rate under 4%, which is the longest stretch in more than 50 years, right? This is a very good economy and a job situation that we're in right now. Now, to be fair, given COVID in Trump's last year in office, it's really hard to directly compare the statistics. I'm trying to give credit here and be very, very clear, but
I was like, do you mean I can't I think bleach and yeah, I can't.
But on the job stats, COVID messed with our society for sure. And under Trump, there were 100 months of continuous US monthly job gains, ultimately adding 7 million jobs. But we saw that end in February 2019 as the economy slowed. And ultimately, he ended his term as the economy lost 2.9 million jobs. And the unemployment rate increased by 1.6 percentage points to 6.3%, right? So you can't exactly compare apples to apples, but we're talking about general trends here.
Well, and I think, what we talked about in our last episode, that the policies that the prior presidents, right, set in place affect following terms, right? So you see sort of, some rollover, right, from prior presidents and their economic policies. And I think we saw that at the start of Biden's term too, right? With the like the holdovers from whatever Trump did, with his economic policies. Because I'm glad that you brought this up, Sarah, because I think, I have lots of issues with Joe Biden. But one thing that I think, has been shockingly underreported is the economic successes under Biden, right? And I think for all of us, right, not just for a small handful of super rich people, but for all of us. And I think that, we love fact and we love truth. And this is one of those things that is just true. So I'm so glad that we're highlighting this, because I would honestly lead with all of this, and I don't think your average American knows quite the level of economic success that's happened.
Yeah. If you're doubting us right now, go actually read the factual news on the statistics, not coming from either, partisan source themselves. But if you look, there are so many articles right now talking about why aren't average Americans more satisfied with Biden's performance? Because if you look at the numbers, if you look at the infrastructure investment, if you look at so much, we are doing incredibly, incredibly unusually well, given what's going on in the world at the moment. And it might be inflation, but we also have to look at corporate greed versus inflation that's affecting the rest of the world and a lot of other things that are going on. But that brings me to financial wellness, because we're segueing from sort of job into what we're talking about right now, which is, is how are we feeling financially? And financial wellness is about managing your resources, to live within your means, making informed financial decisions and investments, setting realistic goals, and really having, preparing for and short-term and long-term needs or emergencies, having enough to have an emergency fund. I will say I'm not really sure our country is teaching these skills. I really don't think my kids are learning that at school, at public school. And based on what we can see with the national debt levels reaching epic proportions under our latest presidencies, I don't think we are really living that as a general rule, right? Like if you look at the chart since the 1990s, our national debt level just goes up, 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 up. So as a nation, we and our representatives who vote on these things are not really caring, let's be clear, about living within our means. And at this point, the International Monetary Foundation, the IMF, is saying that the US deficit is actually posing significant risks to the global economy. So not great there. But if we bring it down to a local level, like our personal level, how can any of us be financially well when we have great and growing income and wealth inequality and a lack of social safety nets? Right? It's interesting to me the hypocrisy of those who come out strongly against any safety nets, which are things like social pensions, in-kind and food transfers, conditional and unconditional cash transfers, fee waivers, public works, school feeding programs, like to make sure our children are not hungry. Those people who come out strongly against those seem totally okay with the COVID relief bailout for small businesses, those PPP, the Paycheck Protection Programs. And in fact, just as a point, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who speaks out against student loan forgiveness, for example, had over $183,000 in PPP loans forgiven. I also think many of the same folks love the library, police, fire departments, public schools, highways, judges, defense spending, right? These are all also things that we look out for one another as a society and spend money on through safety nets. So referencing our last point about job security, Biden has been fighting for fairer wages. He's been finalizing rules for overtime compensation most recently. Whereas, Misasha, you referenced it, Trump has been fighting for tax cuts that were skewed to the rich. That kind of stuff was expensive and eroded the US revenue base, and it failed to deliver this supposed economic benefit that we were supposed to see. And we have deconstructed Reagan's trickle-down economics also in past episodes. We need to be working right now to leveling the playing field so all of us can benefit instead of just a very, 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 very small few people in this country.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that you said that about Reagan because I think we can trace a lot of our beliefs about monetary policy and the debt that you were mentioning, and a lot of that back to the trickle down theory or Reaganomics, which, as you mentioned, also we did go into like quite like a level of detail about it on past episodes. So I won't do that now because I'm sure everyone's really ready for 20 minutes of monetary policy. But I think that's important to think about what that meant, right? You give money to the rich, so it kind of filters down through society, which is a weird concept. Like, even as I'm saying it, probably realize, hey, that is flawed. Yes, it is. And so when you think about Trump and his fiscal policies, which largely involve, the same concept, except now you've got the ultra rich and everyone else. And I don't know, maybe some Russian dictators, like one who just got sworn in today. President. But, I think that, again, we have to look at who is in the fight for all of us, right? And who is really self-interested. Because, again, he has told us who he is. Like, that part isn't going to change.
I think that's right. All right, last bucket, folks. We are here, the environmental bucket. In case all of the other 7 areas of wellness were not enough to convince you that Trump is not here for all of our well-being, let's nail it down with this one. The environmental well-being is all about understanding how your social, your natural, and your built environments affect your health and well-being, right? Being aware of the unstable state of the earth, the effects of your daily habits on the environment, demonstrating your commitment to a healthy planet. So have you ever felt like I'm earthing myself by putting my bare hands in the garden?
That's a no, but I have a kid who probably does. So I'll say a yes for the family.
Well, we are doing this in the spring, and I will say it has been a pleasure to put my hands in the earth and garden and have the space to be able to grow fruits, vegetables, and flowers, right? There is a proven connection between green space and mental health. There is a link between pollution and bodily dysfunction. So environmental wellness includes eco-friendly considerations, right? Actively participating in recycling, properly disposing of electronics and medicine, conserving energy, fuel, and water. and using things like sustainable products to the best of our ability. We are talking right now about potentially having someone heading up our country who denies that climate change is happening. Someone whose administration, as of the August of 2020, according to the Brookings Institute, had taken 74 actions to weaken environmental protection. Another major one, Trump pulled the United States out of the Paris Climate Accords, which was a huge agreement by 196 countries back in 2015 with the overarching goal to hold the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. We were trying to basically do everything we could to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Just as a reality check, Forbes reported that global warming has already exceeded that critical 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold as of this year, 2024. We could be going into irreversible damage. And we're already seeing, I mean, any of us who've been living in this country has seen the effects that wild storms, recent unbelievable flooding around the world, wildfires, hurricanes, and more, right? This is dire, urgent, and real because it impacts us humans. You have massive heat waves, which can hurt the elderly and kids, worsening air and water quality, which can increase the spread of certain diseases and more. Like, we have to be paying attention to it. There are a whole generation of children coming up with climate anxiety. This is for real. And just to point out the other side of it, Biden signed the US back into the Paris Agreement when he first took office. What do we think is going to happen if Trump wins the presidency?
Yeah, I mean, I don't even want to waste time on even theorizing that Trump may care about this because I can't think of a single way in which he's ever demonstrated that verbally or through his actions. And I think we all know he doesn't. But also, as we talked about, the policies that he could potentially put in place during a second Trump presidency are going to last much longer than the presidency itself. And when it comes to the climate and environment, this could actually be sort of world-ending, like life-changing type of stuff. So I think of all the end of the world scenarios. And I also think of, that next generation that cares deeply about the climate and knows that they are in a much worse place than we were when we were their age. Like, what are we doing about this for them?
I like it. So here we are. Not to fear, though, because one thing that is important to all of our well-being is a strong sense of purpose. And in fact, according to research shared by Dr. Kelly Harding at the World Happiness Summit, the National Institute on Aging found this stat, which made my jaw drop. People who can articulate their sense of purpose can live up to 7 years longer, like live well and live longer. So do you want to live longer? Join our purpose in sharing why a second Trump administration will be bad for all of our well-being. Choose how you want to articulate your purpose in this fight and go all in on knowing what you need to know, align with the groups already doing the work, and between now and November and beyond, stay involved on a regular basis, whether that's using your time, your money, and or your energy. Because we're talking about the quality of your life, my life, our kids' lives, our collective lives here. And as we say often, it's all of us or it's none of us. Please join us and let us know what you thought of this episode arc by sharing and tagging us on Instagram, LinkedIn, and wherever else you want to share the show. You've just listened to the Dear White Women podcast with your hosts, Sarah and me, Sasha. Yes, we're on social media. And yes, you can hire us to do talks about our book. But the biggest thing, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter to receive our free materials. Head over to dearwhitewomen.com to get on the list.